Hello everyone, my name's Sam Gibbon. I'm a product manager here working at PatSnap. Welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be talking about 5 trends within wearables as medical devices. In terms of context for today's session, I'll first give you a quick introduction to Discovery, which is a platform that was used to carry out all of the research you're about to see in today's session. We'll then dive into 5 trends looking at wearables as medical devices. We'll be examining this technology area by looking at consumer wearables, VC investments, innovation and patents, academic research, and we'll have a case study where we look into Apple's presence within wearable devices in the health tech market. Finally, we'll finish off and talk about how Discovery can empower you to carry out similar levels of research in the future. Let's first start off by talking very quickly about my company, PatSnap. So we have 4,000 customers worldwide. We've raised over $100 million worth of dollars of funding to date from investors such as Sequoia. We also have 700 employees worldwide in offices such as Toronto all the way to Suzhou, China. So we really truly are a global company. What PatSnap has really focused on the past 13 years of existence has really been allowing people to take advantage of the rich and inventive information that can be found within patent documents, both at the level of a single patent, so you could start to understand what that new invention your competitors just poured thousands of R&D dollars into producing and creating, but also at the level of hundreds, if not thousands of patents, so you can understand how a technology area is growing and developing over time. What we've noticed over the past 2 years is that while patents are a fantastic foundation for carrying out research, the clients that we work with are often responsible for strategic decision making. Whether or not this is deciding which ideas to take forward, which could potentially become commercially successful products, what technology areas should they begin to move into, what partners could they identify to start to leverage expertise and resources from outside of the company, or indeed starting to monitor their competitors to understand what they're up to and how a market is growing and developing. They told us that patents, while a fantastic foundation for carrying out this kind of research for strategic decisions, is really only one piece of the puzzle. It's only one data set. In order to be fully confident in their decision and be truly kind of data driven, they need to take into account a wide variety of different signals. They told us a huge variety of different data sets were important to them. Things like VC investments, so they could start to understand what startups are starting to receive investments in a particular technology area, or indeed where investors are placing their bets that they think are going to be the successful companies of tomorrow. They also told us things like news stories to understand what new product launches are being launched within a particular technology area, or indeed what new partnerships are being announced. They told us things like academic papers are important, so they could understand the cutting edge research being carried out by universities, and indeed looking at the partnerships between commercial companies and universities. So the people we work with, strategic decision makers, have told us that all these different data sets are vital for their decision making. And that was really the ethos and the real drive for us to develop this new platform called Discovery. And what Discovery is seeking to do is take all those data sets we just saw and put them in one place. But we're not just kind of dumping them in one platform. We're working hard to connect all these different data sets. We're connecting the world's innovation data. Whereas before, you may have had to utilize 4 or 5 different tools to start to understand what your competitor was up to, for example. One tool for news, one tool for patents, one tool for academic research, one tool for financial information, and so on. Discovery is really trying to take all these kind of separate pieces of the puzzle, all these individual data sources, and slot them all together to form that overarching image as to a competitor's innovation strategy, or how a market is growing and developing over time, or how a technology area is starting to change. That's really the ethos of the Discovery platform. But okay, that's enough about Discovery and about PatSnap. Let's dive into the topic of today's session. Let's start with trend number 1. Trend 1, consumer wearables as medical devices. So there's 3 major categories of wearable devices in health tech that I've come across. The first one is consumer electronics, things like fitness trackers and smartwatches. That's really where we focus the majority of today's session. These are devices which are increasingly starting to blur the line between what is a bit of a gimmicky gadget and what is an actual medical device. The second category is wearables made specifically for medical monitoring. These are devices which are created by kind of traditional medical device companies which have a clinical setting in mind. The third category are traditional wearable devices, or traditional medical devices, which are becoming wearable. So there's a company here called AdWac, I think that's how you pronounce it. They have created a portable dialysis machine, which could greatly improve the lives of people who have kidney failure, for example. If we actually home in and focus now on consumer electronics, things like fitness trackers and smartwatches, what we see is consumer spending, or indeed a report carried out by Gartner, indicates that consumer spending on wearable devices is to double by 2021. So what this means is that there'll be more and more people in the world that have a device which is capable of providing an objective measure of their health, an objective measure of some sort of physiological signal. So whether or not that's their heart rate or blood pressure, or even things such as, the steps taken or the quality of their sleep. This not only empowers the individual themselves to start to manage and monitor their own health, but the sheer amount of data being created by these devices is also a huge opportunity for the healthcare industry as a whole to start to take advantage of this data to ultimately improve healthcare outcomes. We can also start to look at some of the signals which are increasingly starting to be collected by these wearable devices. And that's almost where the power of these devices lie. They can not only provide one kind of clear objective signal about someone's heart rate, for example, but the increasing range of different signals that wearables are capable of measuring, things like stress and emotion, cognitive function, sweat analysis, provide a huge opportunity. On its own, an objective measure of heart rate is useful, but it's never going to be predictive of someone's health. You could never use that data to start to tackle kind of serious health outcomes, or at least not on a lot of cases. But by taking all these different objective signals together and starting to connect them, that builds up a far more detailed and fuller picture of an individual's health. And perhaps in the future, by connecting all these different data sets together, it would empower the healthcare industry to start to tackle serious health issues even before they arise. So increasing uptake of consumer wearables could directly impact insurers and the healthcare market. Insurers could perhaps better predict payouts and offer policies with increased accuracy as a result of having an objective measure of the health of the people that they actually insure. So for example, for me, they might be able to see that my step count has been way down during these past 3 months in quarantine when I've been locked in my flat. They can also see perhaps my heart rate has not gone above a certain level because I haven't been able to go to the gym. And God forbid, they're able to see my Uber Eats and Deliveroo orders to see that I've been eating a great deal of takeout and fast food. They may think that, well, Sam is now increasingly high risk of a bunch of kind of negative health outcomes. We need to increase his kind of monthly contributions. Or in the future, people like Sam, we need to offer him a more expensive policy to begin with. Perhaps the second category, and more kind of, more ethical, is the kind of healthcare industry. So continually monitoring kind of biometrics and having this kind of physiological measures directly fed to doctors and GPs could provide a much better kind of healthcare and actually affect clinical outcomes in the future. It would enable doctors to detect serious healthcare issues before they even emerge, or indeed identify people who are most at risk of healthcare issues and then offer kind of treatment. One of the biggest problems facing consumer electronics is the fact that there's not a huge amount of actual kind of clinical or indeed scientific evidence that wearables change behavior and therefore affect health outcomes. No one is debating that a lot of kind of these consumer electronic devices can offer a reliable measure of someone's heart rate. The issue here is that even if it does offer a reliable measure of your heart rate, it can't actually change someone's behavior. So it's not going to improve ultimately their health outcome. There's a great quote here from someone called Gert Antes, who says, more data does not necessarily mean better medicine, and this holds true even if the data itself is correct. So several studies have shown that weight loss and health improvement interventions that utilize wearables are not significantly better than traditional methods. So really, to be taken seriously, these medical devices, these consumer electronic wearable devices need to show that they can not only kind of provide an accurate and valid picture of someone's of a signal, or indeed a biometric signal, but can also change someone's behavior for the better. Trend 2, VC investment in wearable technology. So by looking at VC investments within this particular space, we can start to understand whether or not this technology is hot or not, whether or not it's even worth looking at. We can also start to understand where are investors placing their bet? What kind of technology do they think is the next big thing? Let's start off at a high level and just look at the overarching trends for the past 10 years. What we can see is that there's been a steady increase both in the number of deals, but also in the amount of money being invested over the past 10 years in companies that utilize wearable devices in some sort of medical fashion. This is particularly prominent in 2018 and 2019, where there was a sharp increase, with 2019 being the highest year yet for investments into these sort of companies. Looking at this overarching trend, it may start to tell us that investors are starting to see this technology as kind of commercially viable, as these sort of wearable sensors are coming of age and becoming more accurate. Okay, let's zoom in on 2020 and start to understand what sort of companies have received the most investments in 2020 and Q2. There's a lot of information on this slide, but the key takeaway point is that of all the companies that received investment in Q2 that have something to do with wearable device technology, they are in a variety of different industries, and they have a variety of different approaches for how they utilize wearable technology. Some of them are traditional medical devices like SC Pharmaceuticals. Other are insurance companies like Oscar, which are starting to incorporate wearable devices in how they offer their policies. We also have companies like SC Pharmaceuticals, which have developed a wearable device which allows drugs to be self-administered, which would otherwise require people to go into a hospital and have an IV drip. We also have companies like Rapid SOS, who have started to allow data such as wearable devices and mobile phones to be utilized by emergency response services. So things like ambulances or the police start to utilize your wearable device to detect that you're having, a heart attack and find your location easily to come to your aid. So let's look at some of the top funded and noteworthy startups of 2020. This company here called Element Science is particularly interesting. They're looking at solving the problem of sudden cardiac death, which affects over the lives of 325,000 people every year in the US. What they've done is essentially developed a defibrillator which can be worn, which not only feeds data back to the person who's wearing it to give assurances of their heart health, but also in the case of a cardiac event, this defibrillator can also work and save lives. This data is also all fed back to that person's doctor as well. Here, they have a device which not only empowers the user to monitor their own health, but can also potentially save lives. This company has received over $183 million to date over the course of 3 funding rounds from investors such as Google and Ventures. Here we have another company called Siren Care, who have developed smart textile technology in the form of a wearable sock, as socks often are. And they're targeting people who suffer from diabetes for 2 reasons. People who suffer from diabetes often have poor circulation, and they also can suffer from nerve damage. And this means that they're particularly at risk of developing foot ulcers, which they perhaps can't recognize or indeed even feel, which can develop to go on to become infected or do significant damage to the foot, which then requires the foot to be ultimately, and in some bad cases, to be amputated. So Siren Care has a very noble approach developing the smart sock, which can not only alert, again, the user to the health of their own feet to ensure that if there is an ulcer, this person is aware of it, but can also feed back information to this person's healthcare professional. This company has received $21 million worth of funding to date over the course of 10 funding rounds, and also have 21 patent applications. Here's another company called MindStrong, which is utilizing kind of wearable and mobile technology in order to help people with severe mental health issues. They're developing a virtual care model to deliver healthcare to people living with serious mental illness. They're also developing technology for remote patient monitoring and mental health symptom measurement. So through, for example, a mobile phone, and through administering a variety of different tests through a mobile phone, you can get an idea of someone's cognitive function and start to examine and understand that person's mental health, and if necessary, have a kind of a telehealth session with a healthcare professional who's able to prescribe medication to that person or deliver a therapy session. They have received a colossal $160 million worth of funding to the date over the course of 4 funding rounds. They also have a total, they also have 8 patent applications, which are estimated to be worth around $2.2 million. Okay, that was trends within VC investments. We can see a wide variety of different companies being invested in, from things like health insurance companies to companies that are developing medical devices, to companies who are actually starting to utilize consumer electronics and consumer wearables in a healthcare fashion. Let's go on now to talk about trend 3 within innovation and patents within wearable technology. So we can start to utilize patents in order to understand what the new ideas being coming up with in this particular technology area that people think are worth protecting. We can also start to understand who are the major players within this particular technology area when it comes to the number of new inventions being protected. We can also start to dig into the patent trends in a little bit more detail and start to understand what kinds of technology are receiving kind of the most attention when it comes to new intellectual property. Let's start off at a fairly kind of wide lens and start to look at the patenting trend over the past 10 years. And what we can see is that there's been a fairly rapid increase in the number of patents being filed that are to do with wearables and utilize or are focused in on the kind of the healthcare space. So from 2013 onwards, there's been a sustained and rapid increase in developing and protecting wearables which have some medical application. From about 2016 onwards, this has kind of plateaued a little bit, but there's still a sustained interest in protecting new inventions within this particular technology area. Filing a patent is a fairly costly process. Companies wouldn't do so unless they either wanted to commercialize that piece of technology themselves by producing or selling it, or indeed they want to stop other companies from doing so. So this rapid increase may tell us that these companies think that this technology area is starting to come of age and is worth kind of having intellectual property within that space to protect their own commercial interests. It also might tell us that this technology area is already kind of rising above that gimmicky gadget to actually be worthwhile. We can now start to look at the types of companies that are protecting their patents within this space. When I was first researching it, I suspected it would just kind of be traditional medical device companies. However, looking at the kind of top 5 companies in terms of intellectual property, we have a real mix. We have some of those kind of traditional medical device companies like Medtronic, and there's cardiac pacemakers. Philips is a bit of a hybrid company. They're also a large conglomerate, but we also have consumer electronic companies, being Samsung Electronics and Sony. Samsung Electronics actually takes the top spot in terms of the number of granted and pending patents within this particular area. So this starts to tell us that traditional medical device companies are facing increased cross-industry competition as consumer electronics kind of vie to improve their revenue through entering new markets. I suspect that it might be likely that we'll see increased partnerships between these kind of consumer electronic companies and these traditional medical device companies, as both sides will probably seek to take advantage of the external expertise and resources that the other players have. And indeed, there's already some partnerships in place, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But here, it's quite surprising that these consumer electronic companies are really having a strong kind of placehold or a strong kind of foothold in what may be considered kind of a traditional and medical device space. We can now start to break down patents and actually look at the kind of trend within that kind of patent filing by looking at the types of technology being protected. This is looking at CPC code. So this is a classification code given to a patent by a patent examiner, which kind of describes the overarching technology that's being protected. There's 2 kind of major trends here that I kind of picked out. One is that wearable technology is increasingly involved in health diagnostics, which is perhaps not surprising, but it's especially within cardiovascular well-being. So a lot of these kind of wearable patents or wearable technology is focused on heart health. Perhaps that's not surprising, given that just about every kind of consumer wearable that I've seen has some sort of heart monitoring, whether or not that's blood pressure or heart rate. But we also saw one of the major players were cardiac pacemakers. Again, their focus is on cardiovascular well-being and cardiovascular health. So this kind of largest trend, perhaps it's not that overly surprising, but it has started relatively early on. The other kind of major trend, or one that was perhaps surprising to me, is having this, one of the largest classification codes was a category described as monitoring patients remotely using a global network. So this idea being that wearables can be one form of intelligence or signal about a patient's well-being that may be particularly useful when combined with multiple other signals. You also have other classification codes, things like determining physical activity and also in vivo sensors. Not overly surprising when it comes to kind of wearable technology. We can now look at some interesting patents that I've kind of come across through my research. So here we can start to dig into a little bit more into the level of a single patent and look at the type of technology being protected. Here, Boston Scientific are working towards objective measures of pain. Pain has always, of course, been a subjective experience. What hurts a lot to someone might not necessarily hurt that much to someone else. Boston Scientific have patented a device which, through an objective measure of an electrophysiological signal, through utilizing things like EEG, they're able to administer a painkiller through electrostimulation, depending on the objective level of pain kind of measured by this signal. There's also other devices that don't just utilize electrophysiological signal from the brain, but also things like the emotion experienced by a person through looking at things like facial expression. So here they're working towards a medical device that could be used to treat pain through an objective measure. There's also another patent that I thought was particularly interesting. One, because it's received a pretty high patent valuation by our methodology here at PatSnap, but it's also filed by Adidas, a traditional kind of a sports brand company. They've essentially protected an idea which allow multiple physical measurements from multiple devices worn by an athlete to be kind of calculated and processed in one centralized location through a device worn by the actual athlete itself. So by having this centralized device that can calculate signals from multiple wearables simultaneously, Adidas hopes to be able to accurately measure and give feedback on an athlete's performance. Rather than just looking at things like step count and the distance traveled, by having a whole host of signals, they hope to be able to actually give actual feedback to this athlete in terms of things like how they've been moving their legs, in terms of their posture, and so on. Trend 4, academic research within wearables. So here we can start to understand the cutting edge research being carried out by universities. While this research often isn't at the level yet to be commercialized, companies often partner with universities in order to leverage expertise and resources from outside of the business. So by looking at the academic research being carried out by universities, we can, one, use it to identify partnerships between universities and commercial companies, but also start to understand perhaps what is the research being carried out that's not at a commercially level state, but perhaps in 4 or 5 years could be. We talked a little bit earlier about how consumer electronic companies have been able to develop wearable devices which can provide almost kind of clinical level data around things like heart rate and blood pressure. However, there is a kind of a gauntlet being laid down in that these companies have not yet been able to show kind of conclusively or give enough evidence that their wearable devices can actually have an impact on someone's health. They can provide strong data, but if they can't show that these wearables actually decrease levels of things like heart attacks or strokes, or indeed decrease levels of obesity, whatever they're claiming that their wearables could help with, if they don't have scientific or clinical evidence, it's not a strong case for these devices to have a major place within the kind of medical world. What we're seeing is that consumer electronic companies are really starting to tackle this challenge. They're doing so by partnering up increasingly with universities, but also including companies that already have a large presence within this area, like Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer. For example, Apple has partnered up with Stanford University and American Well to test if its Apple Watch can detect heart issues. They've then followed this up with a study with Johnson & Johnson. There's also Fitbit is collaborating with Stanford Medicine to study the role of wearables and its ability to detect COVID-19. Fitbit have also partnered up with Pfizer. So there seems to be a lot of collaboration between these consumer electronic companies and these kind of traditional healthcare players and indeed universities in order for these consumer electronic companies to validate the clinical effectiveness of their wearables. We can also look at the academic output of universities when it comes to the wearable device area. What we can see is that there's been a steady increase in the academic research which both utilize wearables when carrying out healthcare studies, but also in researching and creating better wearables. So perhaps further demonstrating the increased practicality of wearables, numerous universities are now utilizing them to not only carry out their own health-based studies, but also to improve wearable technology. And there's a wide variety of different universities here, from the Chinese Academy of Sciences to Imperial College London, Georgia Tech, Harvard University, and Massachusetts. We can now look at some of the individual experts within this area that are starting to make a little bit of noise. Here we have an assistant professor at Caltech who has developed an electronic skin which is fully powered by sweat. There's already lots of wearable devices out there that are powered by movement that might take advantage of solar power. However, this is one of the first that can take advantage of a natural occurring compound that is produced by the skin in order to power itself. It's interesting that this device is not only able to power itself and a sensor, it's also able to maintain a steady Bluetooth connection with a mobile device. Also, this person has also developed a sweat sensor, which is capable of detecting gout-causing compounds. Again, this is an example of wearable devices starting to take into account a multitude of kind of different signals. So rather than looking at things like heart rate or number of steps taken, this is actually able to measure the number of or the level of chemical compounds produced or present on the layer of the skin in order to feed back information to indeed the user, but also their healthcare professional to increase the accuracy in which certain conditions can be detected and diagnosed. We also have another associate professor, this time from Georgia Tech, who has developed a lung-heart sensor chip that's thinner than a ladybug. So that, again, there's already lots of devices out there that can measure someone's heart rate through utilizing electrocardiogram. However, just utilizing this, they leave out a lot of detail about the heart health, and they also can't detect anything to do with the lungs. This professor has essentially built an electronic stethoscope, which is able to listen incredibly carefully to the sound of someone's lungs, the sound of someone's heart. It's able to detect their heart rate and their breathing rate to feed all this information back, again, to the user or indeed to a healthcare professional. But the idea being that if perhaps their breath is becoming increasingly shallow, it could alert them so that they could arrange an appointment with a telehealth professional, or indeed, the telehealth, their GP. Trend 5, Apple's push into the health tech market with its wearables. So Apple's a really interesting company to look into. They're not only one of the world's largest consumer electronic and software companies, but they also own 37% of the North American wearable market. And there's also a huge number of users out there that have some sort of Apple device. What's interesting is that they're also starting to take steps to gather scientific and clinical evidence that their devices can actually have an impact on clinical health outcomes, as we're about to see. So there's a lot of information on the screen. If we start on the kind of top left-hand corner, so Apple's greatest contribution to mankind will be about health. So Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, said this in 2019. Obviously, if I was in the health tech sphere or even the medical device area, I should definitely be paying attention. One of the largest consumer electronic companies have suddenly said that this is going to be one of their major contributions. There's a significant chance of kind of cross-industry competition. In 2018, Apple's Watch was recognized as an FDA Class 2 medical device for detecting falls and irregular heart rhythm. So it's interesting is their Apple Watch, through looking at things such as wrist trajectory and the accelerometers, they can detect when you've had a fall. Also, if you stay still for a period of more than a minute, the Apple Watch can be used to contact emergency services. In 2019, Apple partnered up with Stanford Medicine to conduct the Apple Heart Study, which is one of the largest ever digital studies. Effectively, they recruited people who had a Apple device and a smartwatch in order to research whether or not their Apple Watch could be used to detect a heart rhythm irregularity called arterial fibrillation. Arterial fibrillation is fairly significant. 3 million to 6 million Americans over the age of 65 have it. Also, having arterial fibrillation quadruples the risk of having a stroke within the future. So it's a fairly significant warning sign that if it could be detected early on, it could be useful for preventing things like stroke and encouraging people to take a more active role within their health. This study with Stanford Medicine received a little bit of criticism in that the study was open to anyone to sign up. They were just interested in anyone that had an Apple, an iPhone, and a smartwatch. But the people who are most at risk of arterial fibrillation and stroke are the elderly. And not to kind of play on stereotypes, I think the majority of people that have Apple devices, especially smartwatch, are tend to be younger, tend to be a little bit more tech savvy. So because of that, this study was criticized for the fact that they're trying to detect arterial fibrillation in a population that perhaps doesn't have that many instances of it, or indeed detecting it is not as significant issue as it would be as detecting it in the elderly. So in response to this, in February 2020, Apple and Johnson & Johnson, a pharma giant, teamed up on a new study which aims to examine whether or not the Apple Watch can detect arterial fibrillation, but here it's looking exclusively into the elderly, right? So they've now got a new randomized clinical study in which they're looking at whether or not their watch can detect arterial fibrillation in an elderly population. Now we can take a step and look at Apple's wearable technology and see that it's focused on heart monitoring and measuring movement. So by looking at the top categories of patents within Apple's portfolio to do with wearables and wearable and health, we can start to see what kind of problems they've been tackling through their patents. And what's interesting is that since 2012 onwards, if you had been paying attention to Apple's patent filing to do with its smartwatches and wearable devices, then its partnership and focused on heart health and partner with numerous experts within this area should not be a surprise. One of the largest categories of patents from 2012 onwards in wearable health has been to do with measuring pulse and heart rate. Another key category is evaluating cardiovascular and other inputs when it comes to the wearable devices. And of course, here we have measuring body movement. So here, Apple has been planning this for quite a while and has been building and innovating within this space to ensure that their wearable devices can accurately detect heart conditions, or indeed accurately measure various signals to do with heart health. Here we can also start to take a little bit of a deeper dive into a few patents that Apple has filed recently, which might give us an indication of what Apple is planning to do in the future. One of them here is Apple's patented earbuds with multiple biometric sensors. So here, this application relates to earbuds configured with one or more biometric sensors. And these biometric sensors could be things like heart rate, VO2, and core temperature. So perhaps your AirPods could also start to be feeding you information about your heart health, or indeed a variety of other signals. What's interesting here is that given that Apple is now focusing on the elderly in that study with Johnson & Johnson, right? They're focusing on seeing whether or not they can detect arterial fibrillation in an elderly population. They also have this new feature on their watch which can detect falls. So if someone was to fall and then stay still for a minute, the Apple Watch can detect can summon emergency services. Here, there's an earbud that has multiple biometric sensors. Perhaps it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that perhaps Apple in the future could have things like hearing aids that are capable of measuring blood pressure, or indeed detecting arterial fibrillation, which is a leading cause of stroke in the elderly. Perhaps this is the start of a signal that Apple is developing technology not only for the young and trendy population, but also targeting or deliberately targeting the aging population, especially within Western countries. Here is another device or another patent, which gives us a little bit of insight into Apple's technology. So they have this patent was filed in September 2018. And essentially it's a smart fabric, which when combined with an Apple Watch could perhaps improve the measurements taken from that device. So it's a wirelessly charged fabric-based wearable, which contains sensors capable of collecting things like electrocardiogram, blood pressure, and respiration rate. This in combination with a smartwatch should increase the quality of data that Apple is able to collect through its wearables. But also, perhaps you could be targeting the more athletic population. So these athletes which perhaps don't want to be wearing an Apple Watch when performing rigorous exercise, but instead a fabric-based wearable, which perhaps might be far lighter and less cumbersome, could be of use. So staying on the patent angle, we can start to understand which companies are building off of Apple's patent portfolio, which companies are citing Apple's patents as prior art while they develop their own technology and innovation. What's really interesting is when you look at the types of companies that are citing Apple's patents, they come from a wide variety of different industries and kind of operate within different markets. We have kind of sports equipment companies like Adidas and Fitbit. We also have electronic companies like Samsung Electronics and Bose. And then we have a wide range of medical device companies, people like Johnson & Johnson and AliveCor. These companies are building off of Apple's patent portfolio in this area to do with wearables and health tech. They're clearly paying attention to what Apple is doing, and they're starting to think that they need to develop their own intellectual property, which is building off of Apple's kind of previous innovation. Again, going back to this idea of kind of cross-industrial competition, here we can see perhaps these medical device companies 5-6 years ago would never have thought that they were building off of a consumer electronic company's patent portfolio or indeed their inventions. But here we are; they're starting to face competition from a different industry. And here, for example, we see that Johnson & Johnson, while they are citing and building off of Apple's patents within this space, they actually already have a partnership in place with Apple, and that they're helping Apple carry out their study looking at arterial fibrillation within the elderly. That's just kind of one output of the partnership. It may be much wider and much deeper than that. So patents are a fantastic way to start to understand what intellectual property Apple themselves are developing, but we can also look at the company's acquisition to see what technology they've also been able to get their hands on through acquiring smaller companies and startups. Here's a few relevant companies in front of us. One of them is called TO Health, which has effectively developed a sleep sensor and a microphone in order to measure people who have asthma, the quality of their sleep, and indeed the quality of their breathing while they are sleeping, to allow the person to properly manage their own health, but also to inform the relevant healthcare professional. We also have a company called Bedit, which was acquired in 2017. So it's a Finnish-based technology company that made sleep tracking devices and an app to help monitor and improve sleep. So they actually have a physical device that you stretch across your bed that can measure your movements and therefore the quality of your sleep. So two kind of sleep-based acquisitions for Apple, one specifically to do with asthma, the other one to do with just measuring and improving the quality of sleep. I think most mobile phones and wearable technology has some way of starting to measure your sleep quality through things like movement, but people often don't wear wearables to bed, and often they don't sleep with their phone underneath their pillow, right? So having kind of more in-depth sleep sensors may improve the quality of data that Apple is able to capture. There's also one other acquisition here called Glimpse. So this works by letting users pool their own medical info into a single virtual space and share that data to whomever they wish. So this acquisition in 2016 is just one of many movements that Apple has made into the health records area, both incorporating records from many different of their own wearables, but also trying to allow records from actual kind of health records from their GP or their doctor to be stored and shared in one space. So the focus of today's session, but I thought it's interesting and it should be something you're aware of if you aren't already. So another trend of Apple within this kind of wearable and health tech space is that they are increasingly partnering with insurance companies to offer discounted Apple Watches. So companies like Devoted Health, John Hancock, and United Healthcare are now offering wearable devices such as the Apple Watch through their insurance programs. They could do so for a variety of different reasons, both as kind of like an enticing sign-up bonus to someone who's looking to join an insurance plan, but also perhaps as an attempt to push their clients to a more healthier lifestyle. So the reason, and people often get the kind of a reduced or discounted Apple Watch as a trade-off before performing a certain level of physical activity throughout the week. So they could get an Apple Watch for free, but they have to, for example, get their heart rate above a certain level once a week, or they have to take a certain number of steps each day, or they have to sign into their gym a certain number of times a week. So again, it's perhaps part of an insurance policy's or insurance company's ploy to make the people that they insure more active, more healthy, and therefore less likely to need kind of medical treatment. That's kind of the ethical side of things. There's a little bit more sinister, perhaps. It may push many individuals to be more active and therefore less likely to make a claim, but it also gives the insurance companies unprecedented access into their clients' lives. That in the long term, insurance companies may use this data in order to drive up the cost of insurance plans for people that they think are kind of risky bets, for people who have a similar kind of physical activity to other people that they've perhaps measured in the past. They think they're a riskier bet, so they're going to push up their insurance premiums. Apple's wearables and health tech. Here's a little bit of a summary of points we've kind of talked about. So they have an FDA-approved wearable for irregular heart rhythms and falls. They've also partnered with various universities and existing healthcare players to scientifically demonstrate the impact of their wearables on the health outcomes of people who actually wear these devices. And we've also seen that they've been working with insurance companies to not only probably improve their market share by getting Apple Watches into the hands of more and more people, but to also monitor and encourage healthy behaviors within the individuals who are taking out these insurance policies. So Apple is in a fairly unique position when it comes to this market. We've seen that they have a vast hold on the wearable market within North America, close to 37%, but they're also taking significant steps to not only show that their devices can accurately capture various kind of physiological signals about a person, but can also back it up with scientific evidence and actual clinical studies that their devices can actually improve health outcomes. That their devices are actually not just kind of gimmicky gadgets, but can actually be used to improve people's lives for the better, both by encouraging them to be more physically active, but by also detecting things like arterial fibrillation or mild cognitive impairment at an early stage, and therefore empowering the person to take control of their healthcare and encouraging these sorts of conversations to be had with a healthcare professional at an early stage, and therefore prevent serious illness from developing. So that has been 5 trends when it comes to wearables becoming medical devices. We've looked at things such as the rate of VC investments within this area. We've looked at the scientific research being carried out and some of the experts within this area. We've also looked at the intellectual property being created within the space. And also we've had a deep dive on Apple and their presence and their movements within wearable technology. All of this information that you've seen on today's presentation was found and collated using one tool. And this tool is called Discovery, and it really does provide the tools needed for quick and effective research, whether or not that's on a competitor, on a market, or indeed on a relevant technology area. The reason why Discovery has kind of been developed is that every year the world changes by a huge amount. In 2018, there were 3.3 million patent applications. There were 3 million academic papers published, $130 billion of VC financing announced, and more than 3.3 trillion announced in merger and acquisition data. And every year, this is new technology being developed by your competitors that might change the industry. These are new cutting edge research being carried out by universities that might be ready for that kind of commercialization stage. This is new startups being funded that might be being able to rapidly scale and start to disrupt the current industry. And this is 3.3 million announced in M&A. So this is perhaps your competitors acquiring these kind of smaller companies and gaining that edge in terms of access to technology and resources and expertise within a particular market. So every year, the world is changing by a huge amount, and this is a huge amount of information that could be useful for decision making. What I've kind of seen by working within research and development and other departments is that they've traditionally been pretty poorly served when it comes to these tools. And that tools are either disparate in that you might have 4, 5, 6 different tools needed to collect, news, scientific publications, VC investments, merger data, financial data. These are 4 or 5 different tools that you have to jump between in order to collect all this information, and ultimately tools you have to learn the interface of, which can take a huge amount of time. They're typically expensive, so this market research being carried out by market research firms are often another way of carrying out this kind of research. However, the quality of these reports varies greatly from report to report and provider from provider. They're typically incredibly expensive. And as soon as you get that report in your hands, it is going out of date. Within a week, within a month, within a year, that information will no longer be relevant to some extent. All those reports published a year ago or 2 years ago, do you think their estimations for how a market is likely to grow and develop over time is still accurate given the COVID-19 crisis? Probably not. Or at least they've probably changed to quite a degree. So this information, it is just not enough. So what this means is that the amount of data and signals within the world is continually growing every year. However, our ability to process and analyze this data hasn't quite kept up, right? So what this means is that there's an insight gap. There's a huge amount of information out there that could be useful for our decision making, could allow us to place smarter and better bets or to really understand what our competitors are up to, but we just can't take advantage of it. And that's really why Discovery was developed. We're taking all of this kind of traditionally separate information and putting it into one place. So we're taking competitor intelligence, things like investment, M&A, government grants, universities, research funding, looking at things like market intelligence, so news and tech blogs, market reports, and also technology intelligence, things like patents, tech transfer, clinical trials, journal papers. By having all this information in one area, Discovery can start to piece together the puzzle. We can take all these kind of separate pieces, things like patents, investments, M&A, and start to put them all together to form that overarching image to how a technology area is growing and developing over time, or how how a competitor's innovation strategy is changing. And that's really the Discovery tool. We've taken all this information, and that's been our inspiration behind developing this tool today. That is everything for today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining me and for listening to all the points I've been making. And I want to open the floor for a Q&A session.